Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Harris. I'm the Interim Associate Dean for Public Services and the Head of Research and Instructional Services. And I want to welcome all of those, both who are attending in person and virtual, to our first inaugural Popular Reading Series with Dr. Andrew Hartley. This event is being put on by the library's Popular Reading Committee, and we hope it will become an annual event where you can continue to join us, and we hope to highlight campus authors who have written popular fiction. I'm now going to introduce Jenna Renaducci, who will be facilitating the Q&A with Dr. Hartley, and that will be followed by a Q&A and a book signing if you're here, and refreshments if you're here.
Okay, again, thank you for coming. And for those of you I don't know, my name is Jenna Renaducci. I'm the Arts and Architecture Librarian here, which includes the theater department. And before we get started, I would like to include some information, background information about Dr. Hartley and the Q&A session. So I should say he is actually a New York Times bestselling author of 24 novels, and with a variety of different genres. I had to write them all down because I wanted to get them all. So that includes mystery, fantasy, sci-fi, thriller, paranormal, children's, and young adult. So I should say of special note too, the first book in his Steeplejack trilogy won the 2017 International Thrillers Writers Young Adult Book of the Year. And on the academic front, as Dr. Andrew Hartley, he is the UNC Charlotte's Robinson Professor of Shakespeare Studies, where he specializes in performance issues. He's also the author of scholarly books on dramaturgy, political theater, and performance history. In addition, he's edited several collections on a variety of Shakespeare topics. So I will now hand it over to Dr. Hartley for his presentation, and then we will open it up to questions, both in person and online. Yeah.
Okay, so hi, everybody, real and virtual people. I'm not going to talk for too long, partly because, with a comparatively small gathering, I prefer to hear what you want to talk about and field questions and let things grow out of that, rather than have me sort of waffle on about things that no one cares about. But I would like to sort of start by positioning myself, as you said, I'm sort of a hybrid author. In various respects, both as an academic and as a writer of multiple different genre type stuff. And I think, sometimes people think that a couple of those things, the fact that I'm a Shakespearean and the fact that I write popular fiction, is sort of a paradox, so I wanted to start by addressing that perceived opposition between either the scholarly and the academic and popular fiction, or what we call literary fiction, whatever the hell that is. I think there's a sort of false binary, right? An artificial division between what people consider popular fiction, which means genre fiction, as you say, mystery and thriller and fantasy and science fiction and those kind of things, and a generalized literary fiction, which we are supposed to value more for its aesthetics or its intellectual content or something like that. And to me, that idea, that division, does a disservice to both areas, right? Both to literary fiction and to genre fiction. On the literary fiction side, it leads to the sort of stereotype of these books being about people who sit around and think about their feelings, mostly middle-class white people, right? And nothing ever happens. Whereas in genre fiction, it's all, car chases and explosions and stuff like that, and nobody ever thinks about anything, and right? So obviously this is wildly reductive as an approach to these forms. And for me, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, stories that have a real engine to them, stories that have something that drives them forward, stories that are driven by event, but also stories which have nuance and subtlety with regard to character and socio-political issues and sentence level aesthetics. And to me, the sort of quintessential example of that middle ground is Shakespeare, right? And people, because we have, over the last 400 years, we've put Shakespeare on this sort of literary pedestal. But the truth is that Shakespeare was a popular author who wrote sensational stories, sensational in every sense of the term. And, you know, stories about murder and witchcraft and magic and all the stuff of genre fiction. But of course, nobody would dare to suggest that there's any kind of paradox between Shakespeare writing those kind of stories and doing so in a way that that does have that nuance and subtlety and complexity of utterance and of character and of larger perspective about social issues and so on. So for me, that's the kind of storytelling that I aspire after, you know, that I think is the heart of a good narrative. So that's what I want to do. I'm not claiming to be Shakespeare, but I think that guiding spirit, that the desire to tell big, oversized stories in ways that resonate for people in complex ways, I think that's the ideal. That's what I want to do. That's what drew me both being a writer and to being a Shakespeare professor.
Thank you. And so actually in preparation, our group did come up with a few questions, but I want to give everyone the opportunity to ask as well, both in person and online. So we'll go ahead and start with one of our questions. And actually, I think you touched on it a little now that I realize this. Could you talk about the differences between writing academic and scholarly books versus adult and young adult fiction?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the paradox, the binary that I was just talking about is more about literary fiction and genre fiction than it is about scholarly writing and writing fiction, because those two things are really apples and oranges. And there is some crossover in the sense that you're in both cases, you're dealing with ideas, right? And with things that hopefully you're passionate about as a writer. But obviously the way that those things are going to be presented in your writing are totally different, you know? And academic writing is for other academics. I mean, not even our mothers read this stuff, you know? I mean, nor should they, right? If I write an academic book, I could tell you the names of the people who are going to read it, because the subset of people who are going to care about this tiny little aspect of one Shakespeare play, you know, is pretty small. So again, part of the reason that I do what I do is that I like actually talking to regular people, you know, and I'm never going to do that through scholarly writing, you know, even when I think I really want to share ideas about these plays. I mean, I can in the classroom, but not through books, you know, where every single half claim that you make has to be double, triple checked to get it past the academic gatekeepers. You know, it's a totally different thing. I was at the annual Shakespeare Association conference a couple of weeks ago, which was, for reasons passing human understanding, in Jacksonville, Florida. And yeah,
I mean, I was born there.
Were you really? Yeah. That's all. I actually quite enjoyed it, but it's an odd place. It is, and it's an odd place for a Shakespeare conference, you know? It is. And what made it doubly strange was that the hotel was playing host to two simultaneous events. One of them was the Shakespeare Association of America, and the other was the UFC Ultimate Fighting Championship. So I am particularly proud of the fact that I managed to sell 2 copies of Burning Shakespeare to these guys who were about to kill each other in a cage. that sense of wanting to sort of move between worlds, I think, is something that I really like, but I'm not going to be able to do that as an academic writer. I mean, I'm doing the Arden 4th series edition of Julius Caesar, which I've been working on for 4 years. Hopefully I'll be finished this year, and hopefully it'll come out within another couple of years. But that's what it's like writing an academic book. It's incredibly slow and painstaking. And, as we were saying before, I spend all my time in the library and the archives, buried away in things. And, it's a good day if I've edited 10 lines of a play, And as a creative writer, that's intensely frustrating, so I have to balance these things because it's just an entirely different part of my brain that works in the other stuff. Even when I feel like I'm dealing with, as I do in Burning Shakespeare and in other stuff, where I feel like I'm dealing with ideas that maybe I encountered for the first time as a scholar, and through academic discourse, you learn about things that you didn't grow up with, you didn't know about, and suddenly you get excited about that. And then you have to find an entirely different way to bring that into a popular form.
And kind of following up on that process too, of not only the writing, but publishing. Do you have, would you say, a least and favorite part of the process, whether it's writing or publishing?
Oh, the publishing process is almost always miserable. The writing part, I love writing, right? I mean, especially in that sort of that first draft phase when you starting to feel that you have a story. And the way I work, if the story is unfolding well, I would expect to do 3,000 words a morning, right? First draft. And I will completely lose track of time, and I'll forget to eat and things like that. Probably not a bad idea. And sort of drive through, and then suddenly realize that I need to stop, and that process is incredibly exciting. And then to put it away for a little bit and forget about it, which tragically is getting easier, and then come back to it and reread it as if somebody else wrote it, and get excited about something that is like, wow, there's actually something here against all the odds, maybe this will work. So that part of it is tremendously fun. The publishing part, the finding a publisher, the sort of the developmental edit, that first big memo that they send you and like, yeah, we really love this book, now change it. And that can be hard. It's good if at some point in the process you realize that they were right and you trust your editor and you're convinced that after you've done the work, it's better, then it's fine. The hard thing is when you feel sometimes that people are pushing for something that you don't think makes the book better. I have not had to deal with that very much. So that's good. Though, the other thing is that people don't edit the way that they used to. We were talking about this before, the changes in publishing. And one of the big changes is if they don't think the book's pretty much camera ready, they're not going to buy it. So because the editors are few and overworked and nobody wants to take on a big project. I mean, in the old days, there was that sense that a powerful editor at a big New York publishing firm could spot the glimmer of talent in a manuscript and take it on. They'd say, yes, we're going to do it, and this is how much we're going to spend on it, and this is how we're going to prepare it, and I'm going to work with this author and develop this thing because I can see a future for not just this project, but this author as a career, right? That doesn't happen anymore. That just doesn't happen. If an editor does like your stuff, they have to go cap in hand to sales and marketing and try to get people to buy into the project. And they're certainly not taking on things that they don't think are ready because they don't have the time to work on it with you.
What happened to those people? What happened to those editors?
A lot of them retired because, this is an older model. They retired or died or, moved on. And as a lot of publishers have had to sort of tighten their expenditures, they were not replaced. But also, I think some of this is about the sort of corporatization of publishing, that the all-powerful editor no longer exists because they are now a cog in a much larger machine, which is driven by profit margins, and therefore there are sales divisions and marketing things who have much, much more power than they ever used to. And a lot of the time, those people won't even read the book. They're selling a product, you know. Remember, there used to be an ad for a salsa brand, and on TV, and in order to, and the way that they were selling the thing was like, our salsa is homemade, and with a family recipe and all this sort of stuff, and it comes from a restaurant, and they would compare it to the boardroom where a bunch of people sitting around saying, shall we sell salsa or oven mitts? And publishing feels a bit like that sometimes, where it's just, you know, we could be selling almost anything. You know, maybe that's not fair, but feels that way.
So following up with that, how would you contrast that to your first experience with publishing?
Yeah, I think there was more room on the mid list, it seems, you know, back in the, I mean, I've been writing a long time at this point. So, you know, in the 90s, there was still a sense that books would function in the way that, you know, they're not going to be massive sellers, but they'll continue to sort of stay out there in the world, and gradually they will sort of make money, you know, so they can be profitable in that way. And a publisher, certainly agents, but a publisher also might really think that in building a relationship with you, they were investing in a long-term future where you would continue to improve and build an audience over a long time. I don't think that really happens so much anymore. And books have gone the way of movies, where you remember there was a specific moment in the 70s around Star Wars and Jaws when movies stopped being sleepers, where they would sort of be out for weeks and weeks and weeks over the summer, gradually making money and gradually building their audience. That doesn't happen anymore. Now you make your money on the first weekend before people realize how crap the movie is, right? They advertise and advertise and advertise, and you make all this money and then it drops off, right? And book publishing is becoming like more and more like that. If your book doesn't fly off the shelves in the first weeks, they'll can it. I had a book that was dropped, What Time Devours, where I was told by the publisher that they had basically abandoned the book after 5 weeks. Because, you know, it wasn't selling as well as they wanted it to. So, and of course, when a publisher says we're not going to keep pushing it, that's the kiss of death, right? Then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, yeah.
Kind of going back to these different identities, we were also curious, say if your students here at UNC Charlotte know that you publish both this A.J. Hartley as well as Dr. Andrew Hartley, that you have this kind of other literary.
I mean, they probably know. I don't know how much they care. I mean, it depends, right? I think, you know, if I'm teaching a class in the English department, if I teach a creative writing class in the English department, they'll think of me as a creative writing person. They won't think of me as a Shakespearean. Whereas in the theatre department, when I'm teaching Shakespeare, or if I'm directing a production or something, they may well not know that I'm a novelist at all. And this also speaks to another sort of trend within the industry, which is the loss of young readers. You know, that I've had a lot of students over the years who I suspect don't read for pleasure at all. You know, they read for classes, but I mean, and some of it is, again, it's just where we are as a culture. It's so much easier to binge watch a Netflix show, you know, than it is to pick up a book. And I think that if we're being honest about it, if the publishing industry was honest about it, we would see a significant drop in actual reading.
Is that just gone forever? Or is that-
I don't know.
Get that back?
After the next, apocalypse, when we have no electricity anymore, maybe we'll rediscover books. I don't know. I think, people have said, oh, these things come in waves. But I'm less, maybe they do, but it does seem to me that there's a general downward trend. And having gone through the pandemic, where you would expect reading to have really taken off, and I don't think it has. I've seen different numbers where people have claimed that it has, but I'm not convinced. Partly because everybody was exhausted, right? The number of people who said to me, I actually now read less because of the pandemic, because I can't muster the enthusiasm or the energy to sit down and read a book, So I don't know. I'm not sure if that will change. The other thing, of course, is that the numbers are complicated by the fact that there's so much more product on the market than there used to be, because a lot of people are not using the big New York houses. They're using small presses or they're self-publishing. And, back in the day, if I had a novel that was not selling well on Amazon, say, it would slide down to the sort of 3 million sales rank or something. Now, if I have a book that's not selling well, it'll slide down to like the 30 million. And that's purely about the sheer volume of stuff which is out there. And in many ways, that's great. And it means that I may be wrong. Maybe people are reading more than I think they are. But there's so much stuff to choose from. And as I say, in some ways, this is an embarrassment of riches, right? It's a good thing. But it does mean that it's much harder to search through to find the stuff you want, which is why people constantly go back to the same authors, right? And it also means that it's much, much harder for an individual author, unless they are one of those very, very few recognizable names, to make any kind of real living, because I have a lot of writer friends who are sort of self-pub or small press who, if they're making grocery money, I'd be surprised. They're sure as hell not paying off mortgages and putting their kids through school, let alone living on it in any meaningful sense.
Well, can I ask you the flip side of that? Instead of the fiction, what about academic scholarly publishing?
In terms of making money
In
off
terms
it?
of making money.
That's great. I love your optimism. No, you make nothing. It's astonishing. It's actually, it's borderline criminal. This is being recorded, but it's true. I had a conversation with an academic publisher not long ago, and they said, "Oh, you'll get a royalty on the book." And I said, "What's the royalty percentage?" And like, "Oh, maybe 1.5%."
Wow.
I don't even know how many academic books I've published. I don't recall ever making a cent from any of them. I may, the numbers are so low that it's just not, it doesn't register at all, I could put the income from my entire academic book career and blow it in a moderate evening, and it wouldn't be a night to remember.
Although I have to say, talking about the reading during the pandemic, you reminded me, I was getting a lot of ads for Book of the Month clubs or kits. Although I shouldn't probably say this since we're recording. The one I wanted came with a cocktail that related to the book, but I couldn't get it because North Carolina lost.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But I guess we can open it up and see if anyone in the audience, including who's online, if you have a question.
Yes, two questions. Well, one, I'll ask the person asking this. Would you consider self-publishing?
I would consider it, but I like writing books. I don't particularly like selling them. I don't like being the person solely responsible for the marketing and so on of a book. You know, that it's exhausting. I have a lot of self-publishing friends, and they are doing conventions and such every single weekend, and it becomes a lifestyle, right? And they enjoy it, which is fine, you know, but again, you're barely covering the costs of going to the conventions. In fact, I suspect most of the time they're not, you know, in order to try and gradually build a profile or a reputation. Now, I have other friends, a few, who self-publish, and they do make a living, and they make a living by generating a very specific product in large quantities, like 10 books a year.
Wow.
And they are working within a particular tight genre where they've built a fan base, and they are writing gay romance or whatever. And they are producing a book pretty much every month. And they have a dedicated following who consumes this kind of material on a regular basis. And they make, now, you know, if you want to do that, all power to you. That does not interest me, because it starts to feel like bagging groceries. You know, it's like, if I'm on that kind of treadmill and generating stuff at that kind of rate, I'm no longer doing it for myself. I mean, and this is the ugly reality between my sort of hybrid career, right? I can talk about it in very sort of appealing and esoteric terms. But the bottom line is, I don't need my books to sell to pay my mortgage and put my kids through school, right? I have another salary, and that means that I can write whatever I want to write whenever I want to write it. And it might drive my agent up the wall. It totally drives my agent up the wall. But it's liberating, right? And it means that I can write what I feel like writing. I mean, you look at these idiot titles, and they're all over the place. And every time I have a conversation with my agent, she's like, "So when you're writing your next realist thriller?" And I'm like, "Well, I thought I'd do a middle grade fantasy adventure about man-eating shoes," you know, and that's not how you build a brand. It's not how you make a consistent. I mean, a lot of my books that have done well, but the audience for that book will not read one of my other books, right? I think we're very sort of siloed. This used to be even more true in the days where physical bookstores ran the show, because people would literally not walk from one portion of the building to get to another, right? If you're in a Barnes and Noble, it's like, well, here's this author in fantasy, same authors over there in mystery and thriller, but they may never know that even exists, right? So, what was the question?
Self-publishing.
So the self. Well, what am I talking about? So the self-publishing field means that you are absolutely responsible for the success of the book, and I mostly don't want to do that. I just want to tell stories and then throw them out into the world, and not worry about it. So
Okay, and the next one is really a comment, but it brought up a question for me. Someone said, "Hi, Dr. Hartley," and they love your Steeplejack series.
oh, thank
So
you.
my question is, when you wrote the first Steeplejack book, did you intend for it to be a series, or did it just evolve?
Yeah, it's a good question. In the case of Steeplejack, I wrote the first book. Sometimes sometimes you might pitch a project to a publisher and say, "Here's a sample here, you know, the first 10 chapters or whatever, and an outline." But in the case of Steeplejack, I wrote the whole novel, and I said, you know, this is conceivably the beginning of a series, right? That the story is self-contained. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's always how I write. I don't write the kind of cliffhanger endings where you have to read the next book in the series in order for the first one to make sense, you know. My stories are always going to be self-contained. If you want to read the first one and not read any further, fine, you know. But yeah, I wrote it as the first one and then said, here are some directions that this might go if it's a series. And the way that it worked was that was published by Tor, which is probably the biggest of the fantasy publishers. It's part of Macmillan. And they bought, it took a long time to sell the book because, well, lots of reasons, not least of which is that the book is set in a world that looks like Victorian South Africa. And it's very much a book about sort of racial conflict. And the protagonist is a young brown woman of what we would say South Asian descent, which I am not. Some of you may have spotted that already. So that immediately creates anxieties, you know. So the publisher initially says, well, we're going to buy the book. We're going, and interestingly, you know, the book circulated all over the place. We finished up with 2 offers, both from Asian editors, which is interesting of itself. So Tor bought the book and then said, we're probably only going to do 1. And then my editor was very smart. And what she did was she sent that book out to loads of influential writers of color who were fantasy writers, who then sent in sort of blurbs, you know, talking about the book. And then sales and marketing said, okay, now it's a trilogy. And, you know, I understand the sort of the political reality of that, the logic of it. So it went from being a single book with a potential to be a series into a 3-book series. And
now it may be morphing into a movie or TV show? It's
in development for TV as an animated series, has been, you know, in active development for a year or so. But, you know, until Netflix or whoever says, here's a massive check to make this, then, you know, it's still hypothetical. I mean, that's the nature of TV and film, right? That it can be in development for a long time. In the case of the company I'm working with is called Oddbot, and they're great. And they have developed, you know, they character sketches and little sort of animated sequences, and a writer has been assigned to it, and the Bible has been written, and the episode break. So there's a lot of material has been developed over the last year, and they're supposedly partnering with a South African company, all of which, you know, will come together hopefully to sort of cover costs and such as we're simultaneously pitching to Netflix and HBO or whatever to get the kind of buy-in from a big distributor. And Steeplejack's a tricky one because it's a YA, it's a young adult, but it's pretty grim. It's pretty dark. There's a lot of I know you've read it. There's a lot of sort of fairly dire stuff in it, you know. And I remember we were talking to one networker not long ago, and they said, and at one point one of the executives was like, wait, so a child dies in chapter 1? And we're like, yeah, sorry. So this is not really the family entertainment that we were looking for. Yeah. So anyway, yes. So anything could happen and nothing could happen. And I have zero control over that stuff. You know?
But you seem like you've been dabbling a bit more on the television side with Steeplejack, and you have another one.
There are a couple of things that are. I mean, I've been working more with my West Coast agent on film stuff and TV things, and I work with Tom, the Chasing Shadows guy, the guy from Blink 182 and Angels and Airwaves, and he's really interesting because one of the things that he's doing basically is saying, I'm going to make. I have the resources to make movies myself and then distribute them. So, you know, he just made a film called Monsters of California, and we shall see what happens with that and whether that opens up other possibilities. There are other things about secret machines that I think I'm not supposed to talk about, so I can't tell you in terms of development for film and TV. But yeah, there are things sort of maybe happening. You know, I mean, to be honest, I've been through things like this before in different ways. So until I'm sitting in the movie theater watching it, I won't actually believe that it's going to happen. You know, because you hear of stuff that actually gets made and then gets pulled right before release, or TV shows that get cancelled after one episode or
After the
something. You
pilot,
know, yeah,
Mhm.
they show the pilot's like, yeah, well, nobody watched it, so. Yeah, it's a mad. What part of the appeal of writing novels, for all the frustration of dealing with publishing and so on, is that when you write a novel, it's just you, and you control everything. And when you're done, when you type the end, it's a novel. It might only exist as a file on your computer or a stack of paper that you just printed, but I can give it you and say, here's my novel, and you can read it. Whereas if I write a pitch for a TV show or a movie script, I have nothing at the end of it. I have the beginnings of a project, the beginnings of a sort of hypothetical thing that won't actually come into existence unless a whole lot of people and a whole lot of money comes together to turn the beginnings, that gesture towards an art object, into the actual thing. So I always find myself, much as I love film and TV, I always come back to books, because at least then I can produce something that I think is a finished product, even if I don't give it to anybody except my family, you know?
Christmas.
Yes.
Although I have to ask, when I was reading about your collaboration with a member of Blink-182, I was curious how that came about.
He approached me through my agent. He was looking for somebody to partner with on this project, and my agent said, "Do you want to be considered?" And I said, "Sure." It was an odd time, because the Steeplejack book had been on the market for, I don't know, 9 months, and we weren't getting anywhere. So when this came along, I thought, okay. And I'd just written this other thing, which I was not getting anywhere with, the Cathedrals of Glass, which is a YA sci-fi thing. And again, we weren't getting the industry was already sort of suppressed, and it felt like I wasn't getting a response. So, so my agent put me in touch with Tom, and we started just talking, and he liked what? I don't know. We got on well enough that he's like, okay, come out to California and we'll spend a weekend brainstorming and chatting and such. And then at some point along the way, he said, okay, so yes, I really want you to do this. And I want it to be a trilogy. And I want these books to be like 800 pages.
Whoa.
Or something, or whatever it is. These books are huge, you know? And I'm like, and then I started to panic a little bit. And he said, okay, well, how can we sort of sweeten the deal? And I said, well, you know, I'm working on this other series, this Cathedrals of Glass thing. And he said, send me that. So I sent it to him, and he said, yeah, we're going to do those as well. And so I was teaching a creative writing class on campus at the time, a thriller class. And on day one of the class, I had nothing in the works because Steeplejack hadn't sold. And within about 4 weeks, I had 9 books under contract.
Wow.
And it was terrifying, because suddenly I was like, oh, now I have to actually write these things, you know? And yeah, because Tom was like, yeah, this Cathedrals of Glass, I like that. Well, let's have 3 of those. And I'm like, okay. And then the Steeplejack then turned into got bought and turned into a trilogy. So yeah, it was literally 9 books within a period of a little over a month. Yeah. Just when I thought my career had dried up. And those Secret Machine books are huge and took a lot of work. And in some ways, actually, they are ironically the closest thing to a sort of a more academic thing, because they involved a ton of research, you know.
I was gonna ask who those books are more geared toward. Like,
They're adult books.
They are adult.
Yeah, they are adult. but
Mystery, thriller, action.
they're sort of, they're, yes, all of those. I mean, as I say, they're huge books and they follow like 4 different characters in different periods and in different places. So the architecture of the books was really, really hard to figure out. And they are sort of tonally, you know, they vary. But overall, I would say, well, Tom doesn't like me calling them sci-fi. He thinks of them as historical fiction. And, but they are sort of like X-Files-y kind of things.
What do you consider yourself? An author or an academic or a writer or blank? You fill in the blank.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I guess a writer. If I could get the words out without vomiting, I'd say content creator, but I can't. So I'm not sure. I mean, because I have a goofy little YouTube channel and all sorts of. I just, you know, the truth is, I'm basically about 12, and I like making things, and have not really sort of significantly grown up, and so I'm still doing that. Yeah.
Well, kudos to you.
Although I should say, speaking of your YouTube channel, and watching and watching your video about your newest book, Burning Shakespeare, you had mentioned that you actually started thinking about it in grad school, and you've been working on it for, I guess, about 25 years.
Yes, 25 years.
How has that changed?
Well, it's changed a lot. I mean, part of the reason that I worked on it for 25 years is because I liked bits of it, but every time I came back, the premise of the story is a university administrator who hates Shakespeare sells his soul to a devil so he can go back in time and wipe Shakespeare from history.
Oh.
And there is a group of 21st century humans who are all around the time this happens are killed in a railway accident, and an angel recruits them to save Shakespeare, because the devil and the angel can't interfere directly in human history. So they have to have other people who do it for them. But in the case of the 3 humans who are sent back to fix this, they are not convinced that the present is better off with Shakespeare in it. So the only reason they're doing it is because the angel says they get their lives back. So anyway, I liked the premise of the story. I liked elements of it, and it has a kind of Terry Pratchett-esque, playful, very British, sort of wry sense of humor to it, or at least I hope it does. And so I liked that, but every time I would come back to it, I'd get about halfway through and I would find that I was bored and that there was something wrong with the story. It wasn't working, and it was getting too academic and too pleased with itself and too sort of scholarly smug, you know, and occasionally it would sort of sidelong into lecture mode. Let me tell you something interesting about Shakespeare. Like, this is not the story. This is not the, you know, so I gutted it periodically, and I would sort of change massive elements of the plot. I changed the characters. I changed the age group. I played with the idea of it being a young adult novel at one point, but it never really worked. And the other thing is that in the course of this time, of course, academia itself was evolving radically, changing. The things that we think Shakespeare is interesting for, the reasons that we keep coming back to Shakespeare, were changing, right? So one of the things that I was discovering is that a lot of the stuff that I had got sort of wedded to about the early drafts now felt really old-fashioned, you know, and not just old-fashioned in the sense that I was talking about something from 400 years ago, but old-fashioned in the way I was talking about it as a present-day concern, you know. So in the end, I was like, okay, so either I have to completely abandon this and never look at it again, or I have to completely deconstruct it and rethink it and take seriously the characters who are saying, maybe we're better off without Shakespeare. And really wrestle with that idea, you know, and there are reasons to do that, you know. So one of the characters is an African-American man who particularly loathes Othello for very good reasons, you know. And so it's not something that can be easily fixed, right? Within the story, it's not something that you can sort of whitewash. No pun intended. Actually, it was. Right. So yeah. So I think, you know, the novel is better now than it was, but it's also more immediate and more urgent, more relevant.
Is your writing style like you become the character? Do you like kind of and start writing as the character? What's your process like?
Yeah, I don't know that I become the character. Usually, when I feel like I have a first draft, one of my key stages is to then read the book aloud. And you know, sometimes people talk about, well, what kind of music do you listen to when you're writing? I'm like, music? What do you? No. Music has to come from the words. Turn that music off. And so at some point, I am going to read the whole thing aloud to myself and hear what it sounds like. And you know, and maybe this is also a kind of Shakespearean, or at least a theatrical impulse, that I want to be able to find a bit of myself in all the characters, because that's how I anchor them. That's how I feel like there's some truth there. And I think that's what Shakespeare's good at, you know, that no matter who he's doing, no matter which character is speaking, there's a sense that they're not there simply as a kind of foil to somebody else. They're not there to, I don't know, merely be a sort of plot point, you know. They're there because they are sort of thinking, feeling presences. So I would like to think that I do that. But, you know, especially with something like Burning Shakespeare, which has a satirical edge, there are characters who I'm sympathetic with and characters who I'm not sympathetic with. And, you know, I don't think you will have a difficulty figuring out who they are.
We do have a question from the online group. Who are you reading in popular fiction? In between your writing and your teaching and everything else you have going on.
I mean, the candid answer is not enough. You know, and again, this is my own experience of the pandemic, that I feel like I'm not reading as much as I was. I have become a real devotee of audiobooks. So is that reading? Yes and no, you know, I mean, it's mediated by somebody else. So it's not exactly the same thing as simply turning the pages and pacing it your own way. But I consume a lot of audiobooks. And as you can probably tell from my own output, I read all over the place. I read, you know, I do read YA and middle grades, and I read thriller and mystery and fantasy and sci-fi, and it goes all over the place. I've been reading a lot of Harry Bosch novels recently by Michael Connelly, who I think is sort of a master at that kind of storytelling. I'm a huge fan of Terry Pratchett, who I consume like all the time and go back to over and over again. So yeah. What else? I recently read, it's called The Maid. It's a big New York Times bestseller, and I forget who wrote it. Do you remember? And it's interesting because it's a sort of, it feels a little like a sort of Agatha Christie kind of frame, but the protagonist is sort of neurodivergent, and she works in a hotel, and she's sort of a witness to a murder, kind of. And in some ways, it's reminiscent of something like The Curious Incidents of the Dog in the Night, or The Dead Fathers Club, the Matt Haig novel, where you have a kind of unreliable narrator because of autism or whatever it is, you know. And I find things like that fascinating as a kind of narrative challenge, apart from anything else, to see exactly how the author is getting across certain pieces of information while remaining within a consistent notion of character.
So,
I wanted to know a little bit more about your research process for your popular fiction. You mentioned with your scholarly works, you know, was there painstaking, you're in libraries and archives? Does that practice carry over into the popular fiction writing, or, you know, because you have the creative license that comes with it, you can kind of, it's not quite as regimented.
Yeah.
I was going to say just quickly, for those who are online, I'll repeat the question, but could you condense it?
Oh, sure. Tell us about your research process. For
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so if it was asked a question about Dr. Hartley's research process for those of you online.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously it's different because the product is going to be different. And, you know, when I'm doing scholarship, I am simply trying to tell truth of a sort as I perceive it and make an argument about that truth. And so the scholarship is going to be about discerning, you know, things that are in certain respects unarguable. As a fiction writer, the pressures are different because you're writing fiction, but you know, if you're writing fantasy, are you writing anything that has whether it's a paranormal element or a sci-fi element or a sort of larger than life, somewhat implausible story element, you want to anchor the frame of the story as best you can, because if people believe in the frame, they'll believe in the other stuff, at least for the duration of reading. Do you know what I mean? So the Written Stone Lane and the prequel Colbath Street was set in my hometown in the 70s and in England, and they're ghost stories. It's a novel, but they involve ghost stories that I grew up with. And so the research for that, a lot of it was about trying to sort of track down the form of those ghost stories and then trying to research the historical, insofar as there were historical origins for where these things began. But a lot of it also was about making sure that the town was right in terms of architecture and development over periods and such, because if nothing else, I knew that I would get called on it if I got that stuff wrong, you know, and you always get called on it. And so doing the kind of research that you have to do in order to make enough of the story feel real that people will give you a pass on the things where they're being pushed into a different area, I think, you know, it is crucial. I mean, with the Steeplejack books, I mean, the city is made up, but it's based to a certain extent on a sort of an alt history version of Durban in South Africa, because that's where I found the kind of racial dynamic that I wanted to work with, you know, because there's a huge South Asian population as well as a black and white population in that city. You know, I've written archaeological thrillers and stuff like that. Again, you know, you get as much of it right as you can, and I'll use my academic connections or status and write to people at other universities and say, I need to, you know, contact their archaeological anthropology department and say, tell me what happens to long bones when, you know, in the ground for this amount of time. And, you know, because then if I can make it feel like it's real, then the story will fly. And there are certain things that I'm never going to know enough about, so I avoid them. mostly boats and horses, because the people who are into those things are crazy people, and they are completely obsessed with it. And you can't ride a horse for that speed for that amount of time. Oh, well, okay, so don't do boats and horses.
So do we have any other questions? I should say, I apologize for my alarm. I was trying to monitor the time, but the conversation was going so well, so I was ignoring it.
Can you ask them about the censorship?
Oh, yeah, that's actually one of the questions since we're in a library. To make sure I ask it correctly. Yeah, since we're in a library filled with books, we were wondering if you believe anyone has the right to ban or censor books, and do you believe there are valid reasons to ban or censor a book?
I mean, my instinctive answer is no. I don't believe that you should ban books. If I'm speaking as a sort of government representative or something, then I would say no. Not least because I don't know which government is coming next, right? So if there are things that I find problematic or reprehensible that I don't want to have anything to do with, I think it's a slippery slope. You know, the next people who are in charge might find the things that I appreciate problematic and reprehensible, and therefore, you know, it's difficult. Now, if I'm running a publishing company, I think I would take a very different position. If I'm, you know, if I'm a small press, say, then I'm going to publish the stuff that I am sympathetic to, and I don't see a paradox there. I think that one is a particular kind of commercial enterprise, and I'm not saying you should not be allowed to buy this book from somewhere else, but just don't expect me to publish it, right? I've been on panels with authors whose opinions are somewhat different from mine, and that is sometimes taxing. I have occasionally refused to be on a panel with an author whose opinions are, to my mind, reprehensible. I've withdrawn from conventions or conferences because of who they decided to give the guest of honor awards to, or something like that. But I don't believe their books should not exist.
Thank you.
It has a place.
Yeah.
I saw this, I think, or I read this, I heard this from either your YouTube video or somewhere else about you having a Japanese music channel.
I do.
I am just wildly curious how that came about and why Japanese.
Well, I used to live in Japan. So yeah, I lived in Japan right after my undergraduate degree, and my wife is Japanese American. My extended family are Japanese. So and I've always, you know, when I lived in Japan, which is a long time ago, I was interested in Japanese music and in things that made Japanese music different from Western music. Rock, I'm talking about rock music. I'm not talking about traditional music. And I sort of retained an interest in that. And I started this series of videos and things because most of the discussion of Japanese music I didn't think was particularly either interesting or accurate. And so I sort of, and part of it also was that I got really excited about certain bands, and I wasn't always entirely sure why. So I started doing these videos to try and explain to myself what I found compelling about a certain group, particularly because, as I say, there's a recognizable difference from a lot of Japanese rock music and Western music. And it's really interesting to try and figure out exactly what that difference is. And one of the things that I find particularly powerful is a different attitude to melody, to the way that tunes are incorporated into, you know, hard rock and metal, which I find fascinating. But also because I love to sort of dig into the sort of cultural roots of, you know, a different, when people are singing in Japanese and you're sort of, and the song speaks to things about a totally different cultural experience, and then how that is being sort of reshaped and packaged for the present and for an international market, I think is really interesting. So yes. And there's some really, really cool stuff coming out of Japan at the moment, which is just starting to sort of register on the sort of global cultural radar. It's really interesting.
Thank you. Before we move on to the book signing portion, I just want to make sure that, see if there are any other questions, including online as well. We're good. Okay. In that case, we do have books here from the bookstore, and Dr. Hartley will be signing those.